Welcome to This Explainer. Today, we are diving into a truly fascinating analysis. We're going to explore a very provocative and deeply researched book by the contemporary thinker Ali Mohammed Al-Shurafa Al-Hammadi. The core question his work poses is definitely bound to challenge some assumptions. Does the Quran actually validate the Christian faith? We're going to unpack his deep literary and theological analysis of the Quranic text, looking closely at how religious boundaries are drawn, and more importantly, how they might have been completely misunderstood. Now, to ground our look at this today, we are objectively examining research backed by the International Message of Peace Foundation. What Al-Hammadi does here is challenge long-held exclusivist views by going straight back to the source text itself. He aims to break down how traditional readings have often relied on selective quoting just to exclude others. Instead, he proposes a much more comprehensive, unified reading of the scripture. Here's our roadmap for this explainer. We will start with the core problem of religious identity, move on to the salvation criterion, examine the moral testimony, dismantle collective identities, tackle theological disputes, and finally, look at building bridges. All right, Section 1, the core problem regarding the Quran and the Christian faith. Al-Hammadi proposes a pretty bold premise right out of the gate. According to his reading, the Quran absolutely confirms that the message of Jesus, son of Mary, is divine. But it actually goes a step further. He argues that the Quran doesn't exclude Christians based on a religious identity or label. Instead, it explicitly includes them based on universal criteria. If they believe and do good, they are entirely within the circle of divine acceptance and mercy. Moving right along to Section 2, the salvation criterion, focusing on faith and action. Al-Hammadi anchors his entire argument in this highly pivotal verse from Surah Al-Ma'idah. He views this not just as a passing comment, but literally as a foundational, undeniable rule for divine acceptance. The text explicitly names Jews, Christians, and Sabians alongside believers, stating clearly that they will have their reward and no fear will be upon them. It establishes a standard that completely bypasses tribal religious affiliation. So, pulling directly from that specific verse we just looked at, the author extracts these three crystal-clear criteria for salvation. Notice what is on this list: belief in God, belief in the last day, and righteous deeds. But honestly, what's equally important here is what is not on this list. There is zero requirement for a specific collective identity label. Acceptance isn't based on what group you belong to. It's an overarching rule based purely on individual faith and positive, righteous action. That brings us to Section 3, the moral testimony for Christ's followers. The text points out something fascinating. The Quran actually attributes divine moral fruits to the followers of Christ. Al-Hammadi highlights verses that note the deep compassion, mercy, and humility placed in the hearts of those who follow Jesus. It specifically praises priests and monks for their lack of arrogance and their devotion. This isn't just a vague compliment, it's a direct ethical and spiritual validation. And this sets up a brilliant paradox. Al-Hammadi asks a crucial question. How on earth could a precise divine text credit these people with such holy, elevated traits if they were entirely outside the fold of God's acceptance? I mean, if they were meant to be rejected, why would the Quran offer such a glowing moral testimony about the fruits of their faith? It just wouldn't make any sense. Section 4, dismantling identity and moving beyond collective labels. As we see in his analysis of verses from Surah Ali Imran, the author argues the text actively deconstructs generalized identities. The Quran explicitly says they are not all the same, meaning you just cannot paint an entire religious group with one broad brush. It evaluates people strictly on their individual faith and personal conduct, which completely dismantles the idea of a ready-made collective identity. On to Section 5, theological disputes and God's ultimate judgment. Now, the author certainly doesn't ignore the elephant in the room. The Quran definitely critiques certain Christian theological concepts, like the concept of the Trinity or viewing Jesus as God, but Al-Hammadi highlights a massive nuance here. It's all about exactly how these critiques are framed within the text itself. He points out that these theological judgments come directly from God, in the divine voice. The wording reveals that this is God's exclusive domain. The Quran does not delegate the power of exclusion, excommunication, or punishment to human beings. It doesn't command believers to attack people they disagree with theologically. That ultimate judgment is left entirely up to the Creator. Which leads us to our final section, Part 6, Building Bridges and Critiquing Exclusion. When you contrast the traditional exclusivist reading with his textual findings, the difference is night and day. The traditional approach often relies on tribal identity and selectively pulling quotes just to exclude the other, but Al-Hammadi's approach, pulled straight from a holistic reading of the text, is based on individual faith and good deeds. It defers judgment to God and uses shared beliefs as a tool to actually build bridges. And this verse brilliantly illustrates his point. By grounding interfaith dialogue in a shared belief in one God, he argues the text establishes a perfectly equitable foundation. It literally says, our God and your God is one. It doesn't demand identical theology to have a relationship. Rather, it focuses on our shared starting point as the bedrock for mutual respect. So, bringing this all together, if the ultimate judgment belongs solely to God, and if salvation is truly tied to individual faith and righteous deeds rather than what group label we wear, we are left with a pretty massive question. How should this fundamentally reshape the way we interact with other faiths today? If the text prioritizes shared moral action over labels, maybe it's time we start doing exactly the same. Something to really chew on. Thanks so much for joining me for this explainer. Keep learning, and I'll catch you next time.
مؤسسة رسالة السلام العالمية، رسالة إنسانية لعالم أكثر سلاماً.